So 3D printing has become one of my favorite hobbies, and one of the things it's great for is board games. For board game organizers, the 3D printing my own Settler of Catan board game, it's been an absolute blast. And around 2020, I started this project when I got my first 3D printer, slowly working on printing the pieces out and painting them. And everything's been great with it, but I've only played it a few times. And the big reason for that was I just didn't have a good way to store the game. I had 3D printed an organizer, but it was a pain to put the pieces back in and out. They had to go in a very specific way. So realizing that was a problem, and that's why I wasn't playing Settlers of Catan, made me realize I should fix that.
So when this project originally started out, I sketched out my initial design for this box. It would be divided into a few parts to store player pieces, the number tokens, and then several trays to securely hold each of the Catan tiles. Using that as my initial inspiration, I started milling up some old scrap lumber I had laying around. This was a bunch of hickory I was actually given for free, and the whole idea of this project was to use these scrap pieces of hickory and create something with it. And I found out that, some insects had made their way to the wood, and I'd have to go around patching that up or hide in the little crevices they had made. I was able to saw each piece down and then run it through the planer to try and get it as flat as possible. I believe I overdid this a bit, and this actually leads to one of my problems that we'll get to later. Next up, I had now my blanks I was going to use to mill the tray slots for each of the Catan pieces. I threw all these into my Shape Coco, secured them up, and sketched out my design in Fusion 360. I did one piece as a test to make sure everything was going to work, and everything looked like it was going well. Well, until the first problem struck.
Small little problem here. As you can kind of see, I programmed this move and then forgot I needed to actually have both pieces connected. So I figured, I'll just go mock it up on Fusion. Problem is, when I programmed the second move, I had the machine start from the other direction. So now the pieces are not technically lined up. So I'm gonna try and fix this, and we'll see how it goes. I'm probably gonna have to do some manual machining and woodworking here.
So noticing the problem I had made, I went back and adjusted my Fusion 360 files, but I still had this piece, which I was actually running low on lumber. Again, all of this was being made from scrap, so I had to work with what I had. So I manually ran the router back through and widened those slots, and made it work in the end. Next up was just smoothing out the pieces here and then test fitting. The idea here is that each type of tile can be inserted and securely placed in this box. Remember when I said I might have been too aggressive when I was ripping the wood and planing it down? Yeah, this really became noticeable when I approached to making the outside of the box. You see, I had calculated for how thick my wood was and how thin I would need to cut it into, but made the huge mistake of forgetting to calculate the additional width of the table saw blade, which would be taken out. This kind of became an issue when I tried making these seams on my box and made the pieces a bit too thin, I believe. That said, we were getting somewhere with the base of the box cut out of some scrap plywood I had laying around, and then once again lining up all the tiles to figure out how long everything would need to be. I then used the tiles to basically measure and figure out how tall the box would need to be for everything to sit in there safely. And then with it all planned out, I had a rough layout of what my box might look like. The tiles were actually fitting in place, and I was feeling pretty good at this point. What I did do though was made sure to use my old Catan pieces to measure out the size for the piece holders I was going to design in Fusion 360. After that, it was time to start the glue up. Taking each of these sides for the slots, which I had labeled with letters to make sure I didn't mix them up, I was able to glue and assemble them together so they'd be ready to sit into the box. After gluing them up, I made sure to make a little slot for that plywood to sit in the bottom of the box and be held securely in place. I tried to clean up with the chisel, and I got most of it done, but my chisels are kind of cheap ones from Harbor Freight, and honestly, they're not great. And so if anyone has recommendations for good chisels, I will happily hear them out. That said, once that piece of wood was in, it was a little satisfying to run through it a few times. Then we got the sanding everything down, which again is probably one of my least favorite steps, followed by one of my favorite steps, which is oiling the wood up. But once we have the box, it was time to add some felt to the bottom. It just looks much nicer than that plywood base, and also gives a little bit of padded protection for the Catan pieces. Then it was a matter of carefully assembling the pieces in place and gluing them down. I then added a plywood lid, which we get covered with felt, which would then attach to the wood lid itself. Then it came down to finishing the design for the piece holders and organizers and 3D printing them. After that, I reprinted the player pieces in resin and painted them up so they would look a bit nicer.